Marcus Steele Donovan had seen plenty of trouble roll up to his remote cabin in the Colorado mountains, but nothing like the trembling woman who appeared at his door on that rain-soaked October night. After 30 years riding with the Hells Angels, the grizzled biker thought he knew every kind of danger the world could throw at him. He'd survived bar fights, gang wars, and federal raids. His leather vest bore the scars of a life lived outside society's rules. When he told her, "You can stay here tonight," it seemed like simple human decency. But by dawn, when the sound of heavy boots and angry voices surrounded his sanctuary, Steele realized his act of kindness had drawn him into something far deadlier than any turf war he'd ever faced. The question that would haunt him forever was saving one lost soul worth risking everything he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the weathered cedar logs of Steele's cabin like an angry fist, each drop carrying the weight of an October storm that had rolled down from the high peaks without warning. Through the amber glow of kerosene lamplight, he studied the woman who sat trembling at his kitchen table, her delicate hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. She couldn't have been more than 30, with auburn hair that fell in damp waves past her shoulders and green eyes that darted toward every shadow. Steele had built this sanctuary 15 miles up a forgotten logging road, where the nearest neighbor was a family of black bears, and the only visitors were the occasional lost hunter or federal agent looking for someone who didn't want to be found. The cabin itself was a testament to his own hands. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mortar, a stone fireplace that could warm the whole space, and windows placed strategically to watch every approach. Above the mantel hung a hand-carved wooden cross, the only remnant of his childhood, faith that had somehow survived 3 decades of living. Outside the law, the woman she'd whispered her name was Sarah. When he'd first brought her inside, wore clothes that spoke of money and education. Her wool coat was soaked through, but still showed the fine tailoring underneath. Her boots were leather, expensive, but scuffed as if she'd been running through rough country. Most telling were her hands, soft, manicured, with a pale band of skin on her ring finger where a wedding band had recently been removed. Steele poured himself a whiskey and settled into the chair across from her, his own hands showing the map of a different life. Scarred knuckles from 1,000 bar fights, burns from motorcycle exhaust pipes, and calluses from gripping handlebars through long rides across desert highways. His leather vest hung on a peg by the door, the Hells Angels patches worn smooth by years of wind and weather. The bottom rocker read Colorado in bold letters, marking him as a member of the Denver chapter that had been his family since he'd mustered out of the Marines in 1993. "You don't have to tell me anything," Steele said, his voice carrying the gravel of too many cigarettes and too many late nights. "But if someone's looking for you, I need to know what kind of heat you're bringing to my door." Sarah's fingers tightened around the mug. "I witnessed something I shouldn't have seen. Something that powerful people would kill to keep quiet." Steele nodded slowly. In his world, powerful people killed for much less. "Federal, state, or private? Does it matter?" Her voice carried an educated accent, the kind that came from good schools and better neighborhoods. "They'll come for both of us now." Through the window, lightning split the darkness, illuminating the dense pine forest that surrounded his property. Steele had chosen this place for its isolation, its defensible position, and its multiple escape routes. Old habits from his Marine days died hard, even after 30 years of following a different code. The Hells Angels had taught him about brotherhood and loyalty, but the Corps had taught him about survival. He studied Sarah's face in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she unconsciously positioned herself with her back to the wall. This wasn't some runaway wife or small-time grifter. This was someone who understood danger, someone who'd been taught to watch the exits and trust no one. "There's a spare bedroom upstairs," Steele said finally. "Clean sheets, warm blankets, door locks from the inside if it makes you feel safer." Sarah met his eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know who I am." Steele was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm rage outside his walls. 30 years ago I was running from something too. Different circumstances, different choices, but running all the same. Someone gave me a chance when they didn't have to. Maybe it's time I passed that forward. He stood, draining his whiskey glass. But understand this. If you bring death to my door, I'll meet it standing. That's not a threat. It's just who I am. Sarah nodded, and for the first time since she'd appeared on his doorstep, Steele saw something other than fear in her expression. It might have been respect, or maybe just exhaustion, but it was enough to make him think that maybe, just maybe, he'd made the right choice. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and dawn was still hours away. Neither of them knew that by morning, everything would change, and the simple act of kindness that had brought them together would transform into something that would test every principle both of them held dear. Steele woke before dawn. A habit burned into him by 20 years of marine discipline, followed by 30 years of outlaw survival. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crisp silence that only mountain mornings could provide. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of his sanctuary, the settling logs, the distant call of a hawk, and something else. Soft whimpering from the room upstairs, he pulled on his jeans and padded barefoot to the kitchen, where muscle memory guided him through the ritual of making coffee. The percolator's gentle bubbling was interrupted by a muffled scream from Sarah's room. Steele paused, his hand hovering over the sugar bowl, then continued his routine. He'd had his own nightmares for years. After coming home from the Gulf, sometimes the only kindness you could offer was pretending not to. Here, the faded dog tags around his neck caught the morning. Light as he moved, Marcus J. Donovan, USMC, blood type O negative. He'd stopped wearing them openly years ago when he'd traded his dress blues for leather and chrome, but he'd never been able to throw them away completely. They were a reminder of the man he'd been before the world had beaten the idealism out of him. From upstairs came the sound of Sarah moving around, probably trying to quiet her own demons. Steele understood that dance. The way you learned to muffle your own terror so you didn't disturb the people around you. The way you trained yourself to wake up fighting instead of screaming. His cell phone buzzed against the wooden table. A text from Razor, the chapter president. Heat's building in the city. Feds asking questions about safe houses. You clear up there? Steele typed back, all quiet. Routine check? Nothing routine about federal marshals sniffing around looking for a missing witness. Keep your head down. The phone went silent, but Steele's mind started working. Federal marshals meant serious crimes, federal crimes, the kind that carried life sentences or worse. He thought about Sarah's expensive clothes, her educated voice, the way she'd positioned herself to watch the exits. Not a random victim, someone important enough for the federal government to protect or hunt. Footsteps on the stairs announced Sarah's descent. She'd found one of his flannel shirts in the closet upstairs, and it hung loose on her smaller frame. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face scrubbed clean of yesterday's fear, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of a sleepless night. Coffee smells good, she said, settling into the same chair she'd occupied the night before. Steele poured her a cup, noting how her hands no longer shook. Sleep at all? Some. She sipped the coffee, then looked directly at him. You were military. It wasn't a question. Steele touched the dog tags unconsciously. Marines. 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Bosnia. Long time ago. The way you move. The way you scan rooms. My father was military too, was. Sarah's expression tightened. Killed in action when I was 16. Afghanistan, 2004, Steele nodded. Gold Star families understood loss in ways that civilian families never could. I'm sorry, he taught me things before he deployed. How to read people, how to stay alert, how to survive when everything goes wrong. She met his eyes. He would have liked you, I think. The compliment hit deeper than Steele had expected. What did he do? Your father? Army intelligence. Spoke 4 languages, could disappear into any crowd, could read a situation before most people even knew there was a situation to read. Sarah smiled sadly. He used to say, that the most dangerous people were the ones who looked like they belonged wherever they were. Steele thought about that description, and about Sarah herself. Last night she'd seemed like a terrified refugee. This morning, alert and composed, she looked like someone who'd been trained to handle crisis situations. Someone who might belong in a federal courthouse or a prosecutor's office. "Your phone," he said suddenly. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, then stopped. "What about it?" "You haven't tried to call anyone, haven't checked messages. Either it's dead or you're afraid to use it." She pulled the device from her pocket. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks, and when she pressed the power button, nothing happened. "It didn't survive the fall when I was running." "Fall from where?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. When she looked up, Steele saw a flash of something fierce in her green eyes. "From the second-story window of a federal courthouse in Denver, with 3 men shooting at me." The sound that woke Steele wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor or the tentative rap of someone lost. This was the heavy, measured pounding of men who expected doors to open when they demanded it. 3 solid strikes, pause, 3 more strikes. Professional, methodical, dangerous. Steele's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness. His hand, already reaching for the .45, he kept in the nightstand drawer. Across the cabin, he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath from the upstairs bedroom. The pounding came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Federal marshals. Open the door." Steele slipped from his bed, pulling on jeans and a t-shirt in one fluid motion. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor as he moved to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see 3 figures positioned around his front porch. They wore tactical gear, body armor, helmets, weapons at the ready. But something was wrong with the picture. Real federal marshals would have called out their warrant number, would have announced themselves with more formality. These men moved like hunters, not law enforcement. Another voice, younger and more impatient. "We know she's in there, Donovan. Send her out and nobody gets hurt." They knew his name. They knew Sarah was here, which meant someone had been watching, tracking, planning. Steele's military training kicked in, his mind automatically cataloging defensive positions, escape routes, weapons availability. The cabin had thick log walls that would stop most small arms fire, but they wouldn't hold against anything serious. 2 exits, front door and back door. No basement, but a root cellar accessible through the kitchen floor. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, fully dressed, her broken cell phone clutched in her hand. The device's shattered screen caught the dim light, its black surface spider-webbed with cracks like a broken mirror reflecting fractured possibilities. "They're not federal marshals," she whispered. "I figured that out." Steele moved to his gun cabinet, withdrawing a shotgun and a rifle. "Who are they?" "Vincent Marcelli's men. I saw him murder federal judge Catherine Morrison 3 days ago. Shot her in her own chambers during what was supposed to be a private meeting about a case." Sarah's voice was steady, but Steele could see her hands trembling. "I was there to deliver documents." "Wrong place, wrong time." The pounding resumed, more aggressive now. "Last chance, Donovan. We just want the girl. No reason for you to die over this." Steele handed Sarah the rifle. "You know how to use this. My father taught me." She checked the action with practiced efficiency. "But Steele, you don't understand who you're dealing with. Martelli owns judges, prosecutors, cops. He has connections that go all the way to Washington. Lady, I've been dealing with connected people my whole life. The only difference is the size of their badge collection." Steele moved to the front window, peering through the curtains again. "Besides, I don't see any badges out there. Just 3 men with guns who think they can walk onto my property and make demands." One of the men was circling toward the back of the cabin. Professional tactics, coordinated movement. These weren't street thugs or amateur muscle. They were trained killers, probably ex-military themselves. The kind of men who could make people disappear without leaving a trace. "Here's what's going to happen," Steele said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd been in firefights before. "You're going to position yourself at the back window upstairs. Anyone comes through that back door, you put them down. I'll handle the front. Steele, there's something else you need to know. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Judge Morrison wasn't just any federal judge. She was investigating Marcelli's connections to a money laundering operation that involves half the power structure in Colorado. Her murder was supposed to look like a heart attack, but I saw Marcelli inject something into her neck. The implications hit Steele like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one witness to one crime. This was about a criminal empire that had infiltrated the highest levels of government, and Sarah was the only person who could bring it all down. How many other people know what you saw? Nobody. I ran before I could tell anyone. I didn't know who to trust. Outside, the voices had stopped. The silence was worse than the threats. It meant they were done talking and ready to act. Steele chambered around in his shotgun, the metallic sound echoing through the cabin like a bell tolling. "Well," he said, moving toward the front door, "I guess we're about to find out what kind of man I really am." The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass cascading across Steele's kitchen floor like deadly rain. He dove behind the heavy oak table, pulling Sarah down with him as two more rounds punched through the log walls, splintering wood and filling the air with the smell of cordite and pine. "Back door," Steele growled, army crawling toward the kitchen. "Now," Sarah followed, clutching the rifle, her educated composure finally cracking under the reality of gunfire. Behind them, boots thundered across the front porch as Marcelli's men prepared for a direct assault. Steele had maybe 30 seconds before they breached the door, and 30 seconds wasn't enough time for a prolonged firefight. In the kitchen, he yanked open the trap door to the root cellar and shoved Sarah toward the opening. "There's a tunnel that comes out by the woodshed. Follow it and get to my bike. What about you?" Steele's custom Harley-Davidson sat under a tarp behind the cabin, its chrome gleaming even in the dim light. The bike was more than transportation. It was freedom incarnate. 2 wheels and 1,200 cc of pure American rebellion. He'd built the machine himself, every bolt and gasket chosen for performance and reliability. It represented everything the Hells Angels stood for: independence, brotherhood, and the open road. "I'll be right behind you." Steele grabbed a kerosene lamp from the counter and hurled it against the far wall. Flames spread quickly across the dry wood, filling the cabin with smoke and orange light. "Go!" Sarah dropped through the trapdoor as Steele heard the front door splinter. Heavy footsteps pounded across his floor, followed by shouted commands and the crash of overturned furniture. Steele emptied his shotgun through the kitchen doorway, not aiming to hit anything but buying precious seconds as the gunmen took cover. The tunnel was cramped and dark, carved into the mountainside during Prohibition by bootleggers who'd understood the value of hidden exits. Steele had discovered it when he'd bought the property and had spent years shoring up the walls and clearing the passage. Now, crawling through the narrow space with Sarah ahead of him, he was grateful for his predecessor's paranoia. They emerged behind the woodshed to find dawn breaking over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah was already pulling the tarp off the Harley, her movements quick and efficient despite her obvious fear. The bike was a thing of beauty, black and chrome with custom pipes that could wake the dead or outrun the devil, depending on what the situation required. "Ever been on a motorcycle?" Steele asked, straddling the machine and hitting the electric start. "No, but I'm a fast learner." Sarah climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The Harley roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Steele felt the familiar vibration through his bones as 1,600 pounds of American iron prepared to carry them away from danger. Behind them, smoke poured from the cabin windows, and he could hear shouting as Marcelli's men realized their quarry had escaped. Steele gunned the engine and sent the bike shooting down the narrow mountain path, Sarah clinging to him as they navigated switchbacks and loose gravel at speeds that would have terrified any sane person. The morning air was cold against their faces, sharp with the scent of pine and the promise of snow in the high country. "Where are we going?" Sarah shouted over the engine noise. "Denver," Steele called back. "My club brothers will give us sanctuary while we figure out our next move." A black SUV burst from the tree line ahead of them, blocking the narrow road. Steele yanked the handlebars hard left, sending the Harley sliding sideways across loose gravel before regaining traction and shooting up a steep embankment. Sarah's grip tightened around his waist as they went airborne for a terrifying moment, then landed hard on a deer trail that paralleled the main road. More gunfire erupted behind them, muzzle flashes visible in Steele's mirrors. The SUV was trying to follow, but its weight and bulk made it impossible to navigate the narrow mountain trails. Steele had chosen his escape route well. 4 wheels might have more stability, but 2 wheels had freedom. "How do they keep finding us?" Sarah shouted. Steele thought about that as they descended toward the main highway, the Harley's engine singing its song of power and liberation. Someone was tracking them, feeding information to Marcelli's hunters. Someone with resources and reach. Someone who might be closer than either of them realized. The highway stretched ahead of them, empty in the early morning light. For now they were free, but Steele knew that freedom was temporary. Behind them, smoke rose from his burning sanctuary, carrying with it the ashes of his old life. The Hells Angels clubhouse sat on the outskirts of Denver like a fortress built for modern warfare. Razor wire crowned the 10-foot chain-link fence. Security cameras tracked every approach, and the parking lot was filled with enough chrome and steel to stock a motorcycle dealership. Steele pulled the Harley through the gates, feeling the familiar mix of pride and belonging that came with seeing the club's colors flying overhead. Razor emerged from the main building as Steele and Sarah dismounted. The chapter president was a mountain of a man, 6'4" and built like a linebacker, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and arms covered in tattoos that told the story of 35 years in the club. His Hells Angels patch was worn smooth by countless miles of road time. The Winged Death's head logo faded but still commanding respect. Steele. Razor's greeting was curt, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Heard you had some trouble up at your place." "News travels fast. Federal heat travels faster." Razor stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We got word that marshals are asking questions about safe houses and known associates. Whatever you're involved in, brother, it's big enough to get the feds stirred up." Steele felt the weight of his patch on his shoulders, the Brotherhood that had sustained him for 3 decades, suddenly feeling fragile. The Hells Angels code was simple. The club came first, always. Individual members might have personal problems, but those problems couldn't be allowed to threaten the organization. "She witnessed a federal judge's murder," Steele said quietly. Vincent Marcelli pulled the trigger himself. Razor's expression didn't change, but Steele saw his jaw tighten. Marcelli's name carried weight in criminal circles, and not the kind of weight you wanted pressing down on your organization, and you brought her here. It wasn't a question. Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I didn't ask him to help me. I didn't ask for any of this, but you got it anyway." Razor studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who'd survived by reading people correctly. "Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" Before Sarah could answer, Steele's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Nice bike. Shame if something happened to it." Steele showed the screen to Razor, whose expression darkened. "They followed you here." Through the clubhouse windows, Steele could see several members gathering, drawn by the tension in Razor's voice. These were men who'd lived their entire adult lives outside the law, who understood violence as both a tool and a language. But they also understood survival, and survival sometimes meant making hard choices about who you protected and who you abandoned. "There's something else," Sarah said, reaching into her jacket. "I didn't just witness the murder. I recorded it." She pulled out a small digital camera, its memory card slot visible through a crack in the casing. The device was damaged but functional, its LED display still glowing faintly. "Everything's on here." Marcelli pulling the trigger, the conversation beforehand about money laundering, even his instructions to his men about disposing of the body. Sarah's voice was steady, but Steele could see her hands trembling. "This is enough to bring down his entire operation," Razor stared at the camera for a long moment. Steele knew what his president was thinking. The evidence could be valuable, either as insurance or as a bargaining chip. But possessing it also made the club a target for one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. "Church," Razor said finally, using the club term for an emergency meeting. "Everyone inside, now." The clubhouse meeting room was simple: long table, folding chairs, and the club charter framed on the wall. 12 members filed in, their faces grim. These were Steele's brothers, men who'd stood with him through bar fights and federal raids, through good times and bad. But as he looked around the table, Steele could see the calculation in their eyes. Razor spoke first. "Brother Steele has brought us a problem. Federal witness to a high-profile murder with evidence that could topple a major criminal organization. The heat's already following them here." "How much heat?" asked Tombstone, the club's sergeant-at-arms. "Enough that they burned down Steele's place and tracked them here in less than 6 hours." Murmurs rippled around the table. Steele had expected this, the club's survival instinct warring with loyalty to an individual member. "Motion on the table," said Snake, a lean man with dead eyes and prison tattoos. "Steele's on his own. We don't harbor federal witnesses." "Seconded," came from across the table. Razor looked at Steele with something that might have been sympathy. "Votes called. All in favor of cutting Steele loose, say aye." The voices came like hammer blows. "Aye, aye, aye. 7 votes. More than enough." Steele stood slowly, unbuttoning his leather vest. The Hells Angels patch that had been his identity for 30 years came off with surprising ease, leaving behind only faded marks on the leather and the hollow ache of betrayal. The abandoned mining town of Silver Creek sat in a valley 30 miles west of Denver, its wooden buildings weathered gray by decades of mountain winters and summer storms. Steele guided the Harley down the cracked main street, past the skeletal remains of the old general store and the collapsed frame of what had once been a saloon. This was where Colorado's silver boom had died in the 1890s, leaving behind empty dreams and empty buildings. Sarah climbed off the bike, stretching muscles cramped from hours of riding. The altitude made her breath visible in small puffs of vapor, and she pulled Steele's spare jacket tighter around her shoulders. In the pocket, her wedding ring clinked softly against the fabric, a simple gold band she'd been unconsciously twisting around her finger since they'd left the clubhouse. "This is where you bring all your dates?" she asked, surveying the ghost town. Steele managed a bitter laugh. "Only the ones being hunted by professional killers." They made camp in the old assay office, a stone building with thick walls and a clear view of the approaches. Steele used his lighter to start a fire in the pot-bellied stove, while Sarah explored the abandoned space. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through cracked windows, and the air smelled of old wood and forgotten time. "I'm sorry," Sarah said suddenly. "About your club. About what happened back there." Steele poked at the fire with a rusted iron rod. 30 years I wore those colors. 30 years of thinking I belonged somewhere. You did belong. They were afraid, that's all. Fear makes people show their true nature." Steele settled onto an overturned crate, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Maybe they were right to cut me loose. Maybe I should have done the same thing in their position." Sarah pulled out her wedding ring, holding it up to catch the firelight. The gold gleamed like captured sunlight, its surface worn smooth by years of wear. "This was my mother's ring. She gave it to me when I married David, your husband." "Was." Sarah's voice carried a weight that Steele recognized, the particular grief of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. He was a federal prosecutor working a case against organized crime. "They made it look like a car accident, but I knew better. David was the most careful driver I'd ever met." Steele understood now why she'd been in that courthouse, why she'd been delivering documents to Judge Morrison. "You were continuing his work." Someone had to. The case files, the evidence he'd gathered, it was all still there, gathering dust while the guilty went free. Sarah slipped the ring back into her pocket. "I wasn't going to let his death be meaningless." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the wind whistled through the abandoned buildings, carrying with it the loneliness of forgotten places and lost dreams. "What was the case about?" Steele asked. "Money laundering through construction contracts. Marcelli's organization was washing drug money by inflating the costs of government building projects. Schools, hospitals, roads, all of it funded with dirty money, while children went without textbooks and patients waited in overcrowded emergency rooms." Steele felt something stir in his chest. An old anger he'd thought buried years ago. "So you decided to take them down yourself." "I decided to finish what David started. I had access to his files, his contacts, his evidence. All I needed was proof of direct criminal activity." Sarah's green eyes reflected the firelight. "That's why I was at the courthouse. Judge Morrison was going to authorize a federal investigation based on David's work, and Marcelli found out. Someone leaked the meeting. I arrived early and heard voices in the judge's chambers. When I looked through the door, I saw Marcelli inject something into her neck. She collapsed, started convulsing, then stopped breathing." Steele studied Sarah's face in the firelight, seeing past the fear to the steel underneath. This wasn't some helpless victim waiting for rescue. This was a woman who'd lost everything and decided to fight back. "The camera," he said. "You were recording the meeting. I was supposed to document the conversation for the official record. Instead, I documented a murder." Sarah met his eyes. "There's enough evidence on that camera to destroy Marcelli's entire network. Political connections, money laundering operations, witness, intimidation, everything. And now we're both targets. Now we're both dead, unless we figure out how to stay alive long enough to get that evidence to someone we can trust." Steele poked the fire again, sending sparks spiraling up toward the chimney. "Any ideas about who that might be?" Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd met her, and in that smile, Steele saw something dangerous and beautiful. "Actually, yes, but you're not going to like it." Steele found the vintage Winchester rifle in the mining office's back room, wrapped in oiled canvas and stored behind a loose stone in the wall. The weapon was a .30-30 lever action that had belonged to his grandfather, cached here years ago when Steele had first established the ghost town as a potential safe house. The rifle's wooden stock was smooth with age, carved with his grandfather's initials and the year 1952, a reminder of a time when men solved their problems with straight talk and straight shooting. "How did you know that was there?" Sarah asked, watching him check the rifle's action. "This was my grandfather's hunting cabin before the mine played out. He taught me to shoot with this rifle when I was 12 years old." Steele ran his thumb along the carved initials. "Said a man who couldn't defend what was his wasn't much of a man at all." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, defending a woman he'd known for less than 48 hours, using a rifle that represented 3 generations of family legacy. His grandfather had been a hard man who'd carved a living from unforgiving mountain stone. His father had been a disappointment who'd drunk away the family mining claims. And Steele himself had spent 30 years running from the very responsibilities his grandfather had tried to instill in him. Sarah was setting up perimeter alarms using salvaged equipment from the mining office, old telegraph wire strung between buildings, tin cans filled with pebbles that would rattle if anyone approached. Her movements were precise, methodical, suggesting training that went beyond what most civilians possessed. "You're not just a prosecutor's widow," Steele observed. "FBI Academy Quantico, class of 2008. I made it through 18 weeks of training before I realized I preferred the courtroom to fieldwork." Sarah tested one of her improvised alarms. "David used to joke that he married the only federal agent in history who was more dangerous with a subpoena than with a service weapon." Steele's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop running. We only want the girl. Walk away and live." He showed the message to Sarah, who shook her head. "They'll never let you live. You've seen too much, know too much. The only way this ends is with all of us dead, or all of them in prison." From the ridge above the mining town came the distant sound of engines, not the throaty rumble of motorcycles, but the refined purr of expensive SUVs designed to carry men and weapons over rough terrain. Steele counted at least 3 vehicles, maybe more. "They found us faster than expected," he said, chambering around in the Winchester. "Marcelli has resources we can't compete with. Satellite tracking, electronic surveillance, contacts in law enforcement." Sarah moved to the window, peering through the dust-covered glass. "We need to think like they think, like hunters, like prey that's tired of running." Steele considered their position. The assay office was defensible, but not impregnable. Stone walls would stop small arms fire, but they had limited ammunition and no backup. The abandoned mine shafts could provide escape routes, but they could also become death traps if their pursuers knew the terrain. The first shot came without warning, shattering the front window and sending glass fragments spinning through the dusty air. Steele dove behind an overturned desk, pulling Sarah down with him as more rounds punched through the wooden doorframe. "2 shooters on the ridge," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the gunfire. "At least 4 more moving up the main street." Steele levered another round into the Winchester's chamber. "My grandfather used to hunt elk in these mountains. Said the trick wasn't being faster or stronger than your prey. The trick was understanding how they thought, where they'd run when pressured." Another volley of shots forced them deeper into cover. Steele could hear boots crunching on gravel outside, the careful movements of men trained in urban warfare tactics. "Professional soldiers or ex-military, just like he'd suspected. What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. Steele smiled grimly, his finger caressing the Winchester's trigger. "I'm thinking these boys don't know much about hunting in high country. They're using city tactics in mountain terrain, meaning they're about to learn the difference between being the hunter and being the prey." Steele moved to the back window, where Sarah had rigged one of her alarm systems. Beyond the building lay the entrance to the old mine shaft, its mouth hidden by decades of accumulated brush and debris. His grandfather had explored those tunnels as a young man, mapping every passage and dead end. "How do you feel about underground spaces?" Steele asked. Sarah checked her pistol's magazine. "Better than I feel about being shot full of holes." The sounds of approaching footsteps grew louder. Steele counted heartbeats, measuring the rhythm of their pursuers' advance. 3 men moving in tactical formation, probably equipped with body armor and automatic weapons. Time to show them what mountain justice looked like. The extraction went exactly as planned, which should have been Steele's first warning that something was wrong. Agent David Morrison arrived at the mining town just as the last of Marcelli's men retreated down the mountain, his federal credentials gleaming like badges of salvation in the afternoon sun. The FBI shield looked authentic, felt right in Steele's calloused hands when Morrison handed it over for inspection. "Sarah Kellerman?" De Morrison called out as they emerged from the mine shaft, both covered in dust and cordite residue. "Agent Morrison, FBI. Your husband's partner contacted me through secure channels. We've been looking for you for 3 days. Sarah's relief was visible, her shoulders sagging as weeks of accumulated tension finally found release. "David mentioned you, Agent Morrison, from the Organized Crime Task Force." "That's right. David was a good man, a good agent. I'm sorry for your loss." Morrison was tall and lean, with the kind of unremarkable features that made him perfect for undercover work. His suit was expensive but not flashy, his demeanor professional but warm. Everything about him screamed federal law enforcement. Steele's military instincts were screaming something else entirely, but he couldn't put his finger on what was wrong. Maybe it was the way Morrison's eyes never quite met his, or the fact that the agent had arrived alone when standard protocol called for backup. Maybe it was just paranoia born of too many years living outside the law. "We need to get you both to a secure location," Morrison continued. "Marcelli's people won't give up, and we've had reports of corruption in local law enforcement. Can't trust anyone except federal assets." Sarah handed over the digital camera without hesitation. "Everything's on here. The murder, the conversation beforehand, enough evidence to bring down Marcelli's entire network." Morrison examined the camera with what looked like professional interest. turning it over in his hands like a jeweler appraising a valuable stone. The FBI badge on his belt caught the light, its eagle and shield logo polished to mirror brightness. "This is excellent work. Mrs. Kellerman, your husband would be proud." Morrison slipped the camera into his jacket pocket. "Now let's get you somewhere safe while we process this evidence." They climbed into Morrison's black sedan, Sarah in the front passenger seat, Steele in the back. The car was government issue, complete with radio equipment and bulletproof glass. Morrison drove with the confident efficiency of someone who knew these mountain roads well, taking turns that avoided the main highways and kept them away from potential surveillance. "Where are we going?" Steele asked. "Safe house outside Boulder. Federal facility completely secure." Morrison glanced in the rearview mirror. "Don't worry, Mr. Donovan. We'll make sure you're protected. Witness protection can give you a new identity, a fresh start." Steele watched the landscape roll past, noting that they were heading away from Denver rather than toward it. Away from FBI field offices and federal courthouses. Away from the kind of infrastructure that would normally handle a case of this magnitude. "Agent Morrison," Sarah said suddenly. "What's your badge number?" Morrison's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry?"
"Your badge number."
David always said to verify badge numbers when working with new agents. "Of course. Standard protocol." Morrison reached into his jacket, and Steele saw the glint of metal that had nothing to do with badges or identification. The gun appeared in Morrison's hand like a magic trick, trained on Sarah's head before Steele could react. The FBI badge slipped from Morrison's belt, hitting the car floor with a hollow metallic sound that revealed its cheap construction and fraudulent nature. "Vincent Marcelli sends his regards," Morrison said, his professional demeanor evaporating like morning mist. "Did you really think a federal prosecutor's widow could outsmart one of the most powerful crime families in the country?" Sarah's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "You're not FBI." "Very good. I'm what you might call a consultant. Someone who specializes in cleaning up messy situations." Morrison's smile was cold and professional. "Marcelli has people everywhere. Police departments, prosecutors' offices, even federal agencies. Your husband learned that lesson the hard way." Steele felt the familiar weight of betrayal settling in his chest, but this time it was different. This time, someone he cared about was in immediate danger, and the old Marine training that had never completely left him began to surface. "The car accident," Sarah whispered. "You killed David. Nothing personal. Just business." Morrison's attention was focused entirely on Sarah, which was his first mistake. "Now we're going to take a little drive to see Mr. Marcelli. He's very eager to meet the woman who's caused him so much trouble." Steele shifted slightly in the back seat, his hand finding the door handle. Morrison's second mistake was assuming that a former Hells Angels member would go quietly to his execution. His third mistake was forgetting to check if Steele was armed. The blood-stained family photograph fell from Sarah's jacket as Morrison forced them from the car at gunpoint, the image fluttering to the gravel like a broken butterfly. Steele saw it in the headlights, a younger Sarah smiling beside a tall man in a prosecutor's suit, flanked by two children who couldn't have been older than 8 and 10. The blood across the photo wasn't Sarah's, it was theirs. "You didn't just kill David," Steele said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the photograph. "Tell him, Morrison. Tell him what your boss did to my babies." Morrison's professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing something that might have been discomfort. "Collateral damage. Your husband wouldn't stop digging into Marcelli's operations, even after multiple warnings. They were 6 and 8 years old." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Emma was learning to ride a bike. Jake had just lost his first tooth. Steele felt something dark and primitive rising in his chest, a rage that went beyond personal betrayal or professional ethics. He'd seen evil in his time, in war zones and criminal enterprises, but the casual murder of children crossed lines that even hardened criminals usually respected. The car accident wasn't just David. he said. Family vacation to the mountains. Brake failure on a steep grade. Very tragic, very believable. Morrison seemed to take pride in the clinical efficiency of the murders. Marcelli wanted to send a message about what happens to people who threaten his organization. Sarah knelt and picked up the photograph with trembling hands. The blood had dried to a rusty brown, obscuring the faces of her murdered children, but not erasing them from memory. I was supposed to be in that car. I stayed home with the flu. Lucky break, Morrison said without irony. Gave you 18 months to grieve before you decided to continue your husband's work. Steele understood now why Sarah had been so determined, so fearless in the face of mortal danger. She wasn't running toward justice. She was running away from a life that had already ended the day her family died. The woman beside him wasn't seeking redemption. She was seeking revenge. The evidence on the camera, Steele said. You're going to destroy it, eventually. But first, Marcelli wants to meet the prosecutor's widow, who's caused him so much trouble. He has a personal interest in loose ends. They were standing in the parking lot of what had once been a roadside diner, its windows boarded up and its neon signs dark. The kind of place where people disappeared and nobody asked questions. Morrison's sedan was the only vehicle in sight, which meant either he was working alone or backup was hidden in the surrounding darkness. Why involve me? Steele asked. You could have taken her any time. You made yourself a factor when you decided to play hero. Marcelli doesn't tolerate interference, regardless of the source. Morrison gestured with his pistol toward the diner's entrance. Move. Steele caught Sarah's eye and saw something there that hadn't been present before. Not hope exactly, but purpose. The kind of grim determination that came from having nothing left to lose. Sarah, he said quietly. She met his gaze, and in that moment Steele saw past the grief and fear to the woman underneath. FBI Academy training. 18 months of planning revenge. The calculated patience of someone who'd learned to think like her enemies. I know, she whispered. Morrison pushed them toward the diner's front door, his attention divided between his prisoners and the surrounding darkness. Professional caution warring with overconfidence. He'd successfully infiltrated their escape attempt, recovered the evidence, and delivered them to his employer. In his mind, the hard part was over. One question, Sarah said, turning to face Morrison. David's case files. How long had you been feeding information to Marcelli? Morrison smiled with genuine pride. Since the beginning. Every witness interview, every piece of evidence, every investigative lead. Your husband never had a chance. That's what I thought. Sarah's hand moved with the speed of her FBI training, striking Morrison's gun hand while Steele lunged forward. The pistol discharged into the gravel as Steele drove his shoulder into Morrison's midsection. They went down hard, rolling across broken glass and rusted metal while Sarah scrambled for the fallen weapon. Morrison was younger and probably stronger, but Steele had 40 years of bar fights and military training behind every move. More importantly, he had something Morrison lacked. A reason to fight that went beyond money or professional obligation. He had something worth protecting, even if he'd only known her for 3 days. The dynamite was exactly where Steele remembered it. Cached in the abandoned mining town's old powder magazine behind rusted locks and faded warning signs. 20 sticks of industrial explosive, stable and potent, wrapped in oiled canvas that his grandfather had stored decades ago for clearing rock slides. Steele handled the volatile material with the respect of someone who'd seen what explosives could do to human bodies. This is insane, Sarah said, watching him carefully load the dynamite into a canvas bag. You're talking about turning your own property into a war zone. It's not my property anymore. Burned down, remember? Steele checked each stick for deterioration, looking for the telltale signs of weeping nitroglycerin that would make the explosive unstable. Besides, Marcelli's people are going to come for us wherever we go. Might as well choose the battlefield. They'd left Morrison's body in a shallow grave behind the abandoned diner. But not before Steele had used the fake agent's phone to send a message to Marcelli's organization. The text was simple. Come to Silver Creek if you want the evidence. Come alone or watch it get uploaded to every news outlet in the country. Sarah worked methodically, preparing copies of the digital camera's memory card and uploading the files to secure cloud storage accounts. Her fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency, setting up deadman switches and automated releases that would trigger if they didn't check in every 12 hours. "There," she said, closing the computer. "Insurance policy. If we don't survive the night, the evidence goes public automatically." Steele nodded, impressed despite himself by her thoroughness. She'd learned to think like a prosecutor and plan like a federal agent, but grief had taught her to be ruthless in ways that training never could. "What about backup?" Sarah asked. "Other Hell's Angels who might help?" "I told you, I'm not a member anymore." "They made that clear." Steele's voice carried the bitter edge of betrayal. "But I've got other resources." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found the number he wanted. The call was answered on the second ring by a voice gravelly with age and cigarettes. "Gunny Martinez." "Gunny, it's Marcus Donovan. I need a favor." "Well, I'll be damned. Thought you might be dead by now, Devil Dog. Heard you went native with the motorcycle boys." "Something like that." "Listen, I'm in a situation that requires some of the old skill sets. You still in touch with any of the boys from 2nd Battalion? There was a pause, and Steele could almost hear the old Marine gunnery sergeant calculating odds and obligations. "Depends on what kind of situation we're talking about. The kind where American citizens get murdered by organized crime, and federal law enforcement is compromised." Steele kept his voice steady, professional. "The kind where Marines might need to step up because nobody else will. How many hostiles?" "Unknown. Well-armed, well-trained, probably ex-military themselves." "Rules of engagement." Steele looked at Sarah, thinking about her murdered children and her husband's sacrifice. "Whatever it takes to protect the innocent and serve justice." "Roger that. Give me coordinates and a timeline." Steele rattled off the location and estimated arrival time for Marcelli's forces. When he hung up, Sarah was staring at him with something that might have been hope. Marines. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Some of us actually mean that. Steele shouldered the bag of explosives. "Now we need to set the stage." They spent the next 2 hours rigging the mining town with improvised explosives and defensive positions. Steele's military engineering training guided the placement of charges designed to channel attackers into kill zones while providing cover for defenders. Sarah proved surprisingly adept at constructing booby traps and early warning systems as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the abandoned buildings. Steele found himself checking his grandfather's pocket watch, a railroad timepiece that had kept perfect time for
60 years.
The hands showed 8:47 p.m., and Steele estimated they had maybe 2 hours before Marcelli's people arrived. "Scared?" he asked Sarah. She was cleaning Morrison's pistol with methodical precision, her movements those of someone who'd done this many times before. "Terrified, but also ready. Good. Fear keeps you alive. Overconfidence gets you killed." In the distance, they could hear the rumble of approaching vehicles. Steele counted at least 4 engines, maybe more. Marcelli wasn't taking any chances this time. "Whatever happens," Sarah said, "I want you to know that these last few days have meant something to me. You gave me a reason to fight for something other than revenge." Steele felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with adrenaline or combat readiness. "Same here." The vehicles were getting closer, their headlights visible through the trees. Steele checked his weapons one final time and took his position behind a pile of mining equipment that would provide cover and a clear field of fire. Time to find out if an old Marine and a grieving widow could stand against a criminal. Empire. Steele's father's watch ticked steadily in his vest pocket, its mechanical heartbeat marking the seconds until Marcelli's arrival. The timepiece was a 1954 Hamilton Railway Special, built for railroad conductors who needed precision timing to keep trains from colliding in the mountains. Steele's father had carried it for 30 years before alcoholism had claimed both his job and his life, leaving behind only debts and the golden watch that now counted down to what might be Steele's final moments. The mining town had been transformed into a killing field with surgical precision. Explosive charges were positioned to bring down buildings and block escape routes. Dripwires connected to improvised claymore mines would channel attackers into predetermined corridors of death. Sarah had proven surprisingly adept at urban warfare tactics, her FBI training complementing Steele's military experience in ways that created a defensive network worthy of professional soldiers. 4 black SUVs rolled into Silver Creek at exactly 10:30 p.m., their headlights cutting through the mountain darkness like searchlights hunting for prey. Steele counted 12 men emerging from the vehicles, all armed with automatic weapons and moving with the coordinated precision of special operations veterans. These weren't street thugs or hired muscle. These were professional killers. Vincent Marcelli himself stepped from the lead vehicle. A man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit that somehow managed to look elegant, even in the middle of a Colorado ghost town. He was smaller than Steele had expected, with silver hair and the kind of refined features that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than criminal enterprises. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of casual violence and absolute ruthlessness. "Mrs. Kellerman," Marcelli called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "I know you're here. Let's discuss this like civilized people." Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall of the assay office, her finger resting lightly on the detonator that would bring down half the main street. Steele could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become shallow and controlled. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 18 months, face to face with the man who'd murdered her family. "I have a proposition," Marcelli continued, walking slowly down the middle of the street with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own invincibility. "Return my property, the camera and its contents, and I'll make your deaths quick. Refuse, and I'll take my time with both of you." Steele checked his grandfather's Winchester one final time, then moved to his assigned position overlooking the street. Through his scope, he could see Marcelli's men spreading out in professional formation, covering angles and establishing fields of fire. They knew their business, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain against opponents who'd had hours to prepare. His phone buzzed with a text from Gunny Martinez. "In position. 8 Marines, full combat load. Awaiting your signal." Steele smiled grimly. Marcelli had brought 12 professional killers to what he thought would be a simple execution. What he'd actually done was walk into an ambush set by United States Marines who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making bad people disappear. "Mr. Donovan," Marcelli called out, apparently having spotted movement in the darkness. "I know you're here too. Former Hells Angels, former Marine. A man who understands the realities of violence and survival." Steele remained silent, watching through his scope as Marcelli's men continued their advance. The crime boss was playing for time, probably hoping to draw them into conversation that would reveal their positions. "I researched you after our first encounter," Marcelli continued. "Decorated Marine, 30 years with the Hells Angels, respected by both communities. A man who understands loyalty and honor." The watch in Steele's pocket seemed to tick louder now, marking seconds that stretched like hours. Marcelli was 50 yards away, well within rifle range, but surrounded by enough firepower to level the entire mining town. "Here's what I don't understand," Marcelli said, stopping directly below Steele's position. "Why would a man like you throw away his life for a woman he's known for 3 days? What could possibly be worth that kind of sacrifice?" Sarah's voice rang out from across the street, clear and strong despite the mortal danger surrounding them. "Love, you bastard. Something you've never understood." Marcelli laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the mountain silence. "Love, Mrs. Kellerman, I've been in business for 40 years. Love doesn't survive contact with reality. Then you've never experienced the real thing." Steele's finger found the trigger of his grandfather's rifle, the weapon steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. In his pocket, the railroad watch ticked toward the moment when words would give way to violence, when all the preparation and planning would reduce to simple mathematics of survival. Time was running out for all of them. The combat knife materialized in Steele's hand like an extension of his will, its 7-inch blade engraved with the Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor that had been etched into the steel during his graduation from boot camp 35 years ago. The weapon was more than a tool. It was a symbol of transformation, the moment when Marcus Donovan, the frightened recruit, had become Steele the warrior. Now crouched in the darkness above Vincent Marcelli, he felt that same transformation occurring again. The first shot came from Sarah's position, a single rifle crack that shattered the mountain silence and dropped one of Marcelli's men before he could take cover. Steele had taught her to shoot for center mass, to trust her training over her emotions, and the lesson had taken hold. The professional killer crumpled to the gravel without ever knowing what hit him. Marcelli's response was immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, muzzle flashes strobing through the darkness like deadly lightning. Bullets chewed through the wooden buildings of Silver Creek, sending splinters and dust cascading through the air. Steele pressed himself against the stone foundation of the old mine office, feeling the impacts thunder through the walls. "Contact!" Gunny Martinez's voice crackled through Steele's earpiece. 8 targets north perimeter. Engaging now, the mountain exploded into warfare. The distinctive crack of M4 rifles joined the chaos as Steele's Marine brothers opened fire from concealed positions around the mining town. These were men who'd learned their trade in Afghanistan and Iraq, who understood urban combat in ways that criminal enterprises could never match. Steele moved through the battle like a ghost, using shadows and cover to close distance with Marcelli's men. The combat knife felt natural in his grip, its weight and balance familiar from 1,000 training sessions and too many real fights to count. He was no longer a retired biker trying to help a stranger. He was a United States Marine engaging enemy combatants on American soil. The first killer never saw him coming. Steele's blade found the gap between body armor and helmet, sliding home with the precision of surgical steel. The man dropped silently, his weapon clattering to the gravel as Steele faded back into the darkness. Explosions began to rock the mining town as Sarah triggered her demolition charges. The old general store collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris, blocking one of Marcelli's escape routes. The sound was tremendous, echoing off the mountain walls like thunder, but it was nothing compared to the sustained roar of automatic weapons fire. "Steele!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "Marcelli's moving toward the mine entrance." Through the smoke and muzzle flashes, Steele could see the crime boss retreating with 2 bodyguards, apparently realizing that his overwhelming firepower advantage had been neutralized by superior tactics and positioning. The mine entrance would provide cover and concealment, but it would also trap him if Steele could seal the exit. Steele sprinted across open ground, bullets whining past his head like angry insects. His grandfather's Winchester was slung across his back, but the combat knife remained in his hand, intimate, personal, final. This fight had moved beyond guns and explosives to something more primitive, more honest. One of Marcelli's bodyguards turned to face the approaching threat, his submachine gun already rising towards Steele's chest. The Marine training took over. 5 years of muscle memory compressed into 2 seconds of lethal motion. Steele went low, the combat knife describing a perfect arc that opened the gunman's femoral artery. The bodyguard's weapon discharged harmlessly into the night sky as he collapsed, his life pumping out onto the mountain stone. Marcelli and his remaining bodyguard reached the mine entrance just as another explosion brought down the old saloon. Burning timber fell like meteors, illuminating the battlefield in hellish orange light. Steele could hear Gunny Martinez coordinating fire and movement over the radio, the calm professionalism of a man who'd done this dance many times before. "End of the line, Marcelli," Steele called out, approaching the mine entrance with the knife held low and ready. The crime boss emerged from the shadows, no longer the refined businessman who'd stepped from the SUV an hour earlier. His expensive suit was torn and dirty, his silver hair disheveled, his cultured mask finally slipping to reveal the animal underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Marcelli snarled, producing a pistol from inside his jacket. "I own judges, senators, federal agents. You think killing me will end this?" Steele moved closer, the combat knife catching firelight along its engraved blade. "Maybe not. But it'll be a good start." The bodyguard stepped between them, his own weapon trained on Steele's chest. For a moment, the three men stood frozen in a tableau of violence and determination, the sounds of ongoing battle echoing around them like the drums of war. Then Sarah appeared behind them, Morrison's pistol steady in her hands, and everything changed again. Sarah's USB drive caught the firelight as she held it up. The small device containing enough evidence to destroy Marcelli's empire, gleaming like a digital talisman of justice. The memory stick was no bigger than her thumb, but it represented 18 months of careful investigation, digital forensics, and the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors dreamed about. Wire transfers, recorded conversations, photographic proof of murder. "This is what you killed my family for," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging around them. 30 gigabytes of data that prove you've been laundering money through construction contracts for 15 years. Marcelli's eyes fixed on the USB drive with the hunger of a man who understood that his entire world could be reduced to ones and zeros on a piece of silicon and plastic. "Give me that device, and I'll make your death quick." "Counteroffer," Sarah replied, her pistol trained on Marcelli's chest. "Surrender now, and I'll let the legal system decide your fate instead of putting a bullet in your heart." Steele kept his combat knife ready, watching the bodyguard for any sign of movement. The man was professional enough to understand that 3 guns were now pointed in his general direction, but criminal loyalty and self-preservation were warring in his expression. The sounds of battle were beginning to fade as Gunny Martinez and his Marines systematically eliminated Marcelli's remaining men. Professional soldiers against criminal muscle was never really a fair fight, despite superior numbers and firepower. Training and discipline had won the day, as they usually did when the stakes were high enough. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Marcelli said, his cultured voice cracking under the strain. "My organization provides stability, order. We settle disputes without involving law enforcement. We provide services that legitimate businesses can't offer." "You murdered children," Steele said flatly. "Nothing you've built is worth preserving." Marcelli's expression hardened. "Your moral outrage is touching, Mr. Donovan, but irrelevant. I've survived federal investigations, witness protection programs, even attempts on my life by rival families. A broken-down biker and a grieving widow aren't going to be the end of Vincent Marcelli." Sarah stepped closer, the USB drive still visible in her free hand. "David thought the same thing. Right up until Morrison sabotaged his car, your husband was naive. He believed the system could be trusted to deliver justice." Marcelli smiled coldly. "I am the system, Mrs. Kellerman. Judges, prosecutors, federal agents, they all have prices, and I know what those prices are." "Not all of them." Sarah's thumb moved toward the USB drive. "David uploaded copies of his investigation to a secure server before he died. Everything you've built, everyone you've corrupted, every crime you've committed, it's all documented." Steele watched Marcelli's face change as the implications sank in. The crime boss was realizing that this wasn't just about one witness or one piece of evidence. This was about the complete destruction of a criminal empire that had taken decades to construct. "The camera was just the beginning," Sarah continued. "The murder of Judge Morrison was sloppy, desperate. It made you vulnerable because it confirmed everything David had theorized about your methods." Marcelli's bodyguard was sweating now, his weapon wavering between Steele and Sarah as he calculated his odds of survival. Behind them, the gunfire had stopped completely. replaced by the controlled voices of Marines securing the area and conducting battle damage assessment. "Last chance," Steele said to the bodyguard. "Drop your weapon and live, or keep pointing it at us, and join your boss in whatever comes next." The man looked at Marcelli, then at the USB drive in Sarah's hand, then at the combat knife in Steele's grip. Professional calculation won out over criminal loyalty. The submachine gun clattered to the stone floor of the mine entrance. "Smart choice," Steele said. "Now back away." Marcelli was alone now, his empire crumbling around him, his organization decimated, his corruption exposed. But he still had the desperate fury of a cornered animal, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. "You think this ends with my death?" Marcelli snarled. "You think my organization dies with me?" "No," Sarah said quietly. "But it starts with your death." Marcelli's hand moved toward his jacket, and Steele saw the glint of metal that meant the crime boss had one final card to play. The combat knife left Steele's hand in a perfect arc. 35 years of Marine training compressed into one moment of absolute precision. The blade took Marcelli in the chest, just as his pistol cleared his jacket. The crime boss staggered, looking down at the knife protruding from his heart with an expression of genuine surprise. "For Emma and Jake," Sarah whispered, the names of her murdered children carrying across the mountain silence like a prayer for justice finally delivered. Vincent Marcelli, who had corrupted judges and murdered federal prosecutors, who had built an empire on blood and intimidation, collapsed to his knees and then forward onto his face. The USB drive in Sarah's hand suddenly seemed less important than the absolute stillness of the man who would never hurt another family. Steele's blood-soaked vest lay in a heap beside the medical stretcher, the leather saturated with crimson that gleamed wet under the emergency floodlights. The Hells Angels patches were barely visible beneath the stains. The winged Death's Head logo, now a prophetic symbol of how close Steele had come to joining the ranks of the permanently departed. Paramedics worked over him with practiced efficiency, their hands moving quickly to stem the bleeding from wounds he hadn't even felt during the heat of battle. The adrenaline crash hit him all at once. 30 years of living dangerously, finally catching up in a wave of exhaustion that made his vision blur and his hands shake. Steele tried to sit up on the stretcher, but Sarah's firm hand on his chest pushed him back down. "Stay still, you stubborn bastard," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to give orders under pressure. "You've lost enough blood to kill a smaller man." Steele looked down at himself, seeing for the first time the extent of the damage. A bullet had creased his left shoulder, another had punched through his right thigh, and shrapnel from one of the explosions had left a constellation of small cuts across his arms and face. Nothing immediately fatal, but enough to make him understand why the paramedics were looking so serious. "Marcelli," he asked, "dead, along with most of his crew." Sarah's expression was grim but satisfied. "Your Marine friends are efficient." Gunny Martinez appeared beside the stretcher, his face streaked with cordite and dirt, but wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd completed a successful mission. "Casualty report, Devil Dog. 11 enemy KIA, 1 wounded and in custody. 0 friendly casualties, unless you count your stubborn ass. I'll live." "Damn right you will. Marines don't die in mining towns in Colorado. That's not how our story ends." Federal agents were arriving now, the real ones this time, identifiable by their proper credentials, and the way they moved with bureaucratic authority rather than criminal purpose. Steele watched them establish a perimeter around the mining town, their crime scene teams already beginning the methodical process of documenting evidence and collecting bodies. Agent Patricia Reeves introduced herself as the FBI's lead investigator for organized crime in the Denver field office. She was a small woman with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much human corruption. But her handshake was firm and her voice carried genuine respect. "Mrs. Kellerman, Mr. Donovan, what you've accomplished here tonight goes far beyond justice for your personal losses. Marcelli's organization was responsible for murders, money laundering, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of state and federal government. Sarah handed over the USB drive without ceremony. Everything's documented. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographic evidence. Enough to prosecute everyone in Marcelli's network. And clean house in our own organizations, Agent Reeves added grimly. Morrison wasn't the only federal employee on Marcelli's payroll. This investigation is going to reach into places that some very powerful people would prefer to keep hidden. Steele felt the morphine beginning to take effect, the sharp edges of pain blunting into a manageable ache. What happens to us now? Witness protection if you want it. New identities, new lives, federal security until the trials are over. Agent Reeves looked between Steele and Sarah. Given what you've been through, it might be the safest option. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blood-soaked vest that represented everything Steele had sacrificed for her. What about the people Marcelli corrupted? The judges, the prosecutors, the federal agents? Justice, Mrs. Kellerman. Real justice for the first time in decades. Agent Reeves smiled grimly. Your husband's investigation is finally going to see the light of day. The paramedics were preparing to transport Steele to the hospital, but he caught Sarah's hand before they could load him into the ambulance. This isn't how I expected it to end. How did you expect it to end? Steele thought about that question as the mountain wind carried the smell of smoke and gunpowder down from the mining town. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary man living in isolation, his only connections to the world being a motorcycle club that had ultimately abandoned him. Now he was looking at a woman who'd become worth dying for, and the future suddenly seemed like something worth living for. I expected to die alone, he said honestly. Sarah leaned down and kissed his forehead, her lips warm against his skin. Well, you're going to have to find a new expectation, because I'm not going anywhere. The ambulance doors closed with a solid thunk, and Steele felt himself being carried away from the battlefield toward an uncertain but no longer solitary future. Through the rear windows, he could see Sarah climbing into a federal vehicle, her silhouette outlined against the emergency lights. For the first time in 30 years, Steele Donovan had something worth protecting that was still alive. The hospital bracelet around Steele's wrist was a simple plastic band with his name, date of birth, and blood type printed in stark black letters. But it represented something profound, vulnerability accepted, humanity acknowledged, the willingness to let others care for him. For a man who'd spent 30 years projecting invincibility, the small white strip of plastic was more transformative than any Hell's Angels patch had ever been. Sarah sat beside his hospital bed, reading depositions and federal indictments that had grown out of the evidence they'd provided. The scope of Marcelli's corruption was staggering. Dozens of arrests, federal judges recusing themselves from cases, entire prosecutors' offices being investigated for compromise. The USB drive had been even more valuable than they'd imagined. 43 indictments so far, Sarah said, looking up from a thick folder of legal documents. 3 federal judges, 12 prosecutors, 28 law enforcement officers at various levels. Steele adjusted his position carefully, mindful of the stitches in his shoulder and thigh. Your husband would be proud. David would be amazed. He spent 3 years trying to prove what we documented in one night. Sarah's voice carried a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice moves slowly until it doesn't. Agent Reeves had visited twice in the past week, updating them on the investigation's progress and discussing their options for the future. Witness protection remained available, but the systematic destruction of Marcelli's organization had eliminated most of the immediate threat. They were free to choose their own path forward. The safe house in Montana is still available, Steele said. Federal property, but they're willing to lease it long-term to civilians who've provided valuable service. Sarah smiled at the euphemism. Valuable service? That's one way to describe getting shot while killing organized crime figures. Better than the alternative descriptions. Steele touched the hospital bracelet absently. Question is, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? It was a conversation they'd been avoiding, the practical reality of building something permanent from the intense bond forged in crisis. Sarah had her career as a federal prosecutor to consider, her desire to continue David's work. Steele had his own choices to make about who he wanted to be now that his outlaw identity had been stripped away. "I've been offered a position with the Justice Department," Sarah said quietly. "Special prosecutor for organized crime cases. Based in Denver but with national jurisdiction." Steele felt something cold settle in his stomach. Important work, meaningful work, but also dangerous work that would keep her in the crosshairs of every criminal organization in the country. That's what you want. It's what David would have wanted. It's what needs to be done. Sarah met his eyes. "But I'm not making any decisions without talking to you first." The honesty in her voice caught Steele off guard. They'd known each other for less than a week, but the intensity of shared danger had compressed years of relationship development into days of absolute trust. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "Agent Reeves mentioned something about consulting work." Steele nodded slowly. "Federal contract work. Security consulting for witness protection cases, threat assessment for federal facilities. Using the skill sets I developed as a Marine and refined as an outlaw. Legitimate work, legal work." "There's a difference," Steele smiled wryly. "Turns out the federal government values people who understand how criminals think and operate." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his scarred knuckles. "We could make it work. Your consulting, my prosecution work. Different sides of the same fight. Long hours, dangerous cases, federal bureaucracy." Steele squeezed her hand gently. "Not exactly the quiet retirement I'd been planning. Were you happy? Living alone in the mountains, cut off from everything?" Steele thought about that question honestly. The solitude had been peaceful, but it had also been empty. The Hells Angels had provided brotherhood, but not intimacy. His entire adult life had been spent avoiding the kind of emotional vulnerability that the hospital bracelet represented. "No," he said finally, "I wasn't happy. I was just existing." Sarah leaned forward and kissed him, her lips soft against his. "Then let's try living instead." Outside the hospital window, Denver stretched toward the mountains in all directions, a city of possibilities and new beginnings. Steele looked at the woman beside him, thinking about federal prosecutors and organized crime, about justice and redemption, about the difference between existing and living. The hospital bracelet caught the afternoon light, its plastic surface reflecting the promise of a future where vulnerability wasn't weakness, where caring about someone was worth any risk. The new wedding rings caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows, simple gold bands that Sarah had chosen to replace the one she'd worn during her first marriage. Steele turned his ring slowly on his finger, still adjusting to the unfamiliar weight of commitment and the visible symbol of belonging to someone else. The rings represented something he'd never thought possible, a second chance at a life worth living. 6 months had passed since the night at Silver Creek. 6 months of trials and depositions, of federal investigations and congressional hearings. Vincent Marcelli's criminal empire had been systematically dismantled, its corruption exposed in headlines that dominated news cycles for weeks. Sarah's testimony had been the cornerstone of prosecutions that reached into the highest levels of state and federal government. The courthouse wedding had been Sarah's idea, a quiet ceremony with Agent Reeves and Gunny Martinez as witnesses. No elaborate celebration, no extended family gatherings, just two people who'd found each other in the middle of a war and decided to build something peaceful together. "Mrs. Donovan," Steele said, testing the sound of Sarah's new name. "I like the sound of that." Sarah adjusted her own ring, the gold warm against her skin. "Though my colleagues at Justice are going to have a field day with the paperwork." Steele's consulting business had grown beyond federal witness protection to include corporate security and law enforcement training. He found himself teaching courses on criminal psychology and tactical thinking to FBI agents and federal marshals, sharing insights gleaned from 30 years on both sides of the law. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked as they walked down the courthouse steps towards Steele's new truck, a practical vehicle that reflected his transition from outlaw to legitimate businessman. Steele considered the question seriously. The Hells Angels had officially expelled him during a formal ceremony that had stripped away 3 decades of identity and brotherhood. The outlaw life that had sustained him through middle age was gone forever, replaced by mortgage payments and federal security clearances. Some, he said honestly, the brotherhood, the freedom, the simplicity of living outside society's rules. But I was dying by degrees up in that cabin. 47 years old and already writing my own obituary. Steele opened the truck door for Sarah, the gesture automatic after months of learning to be a husband. "You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive." They drove through Denver's downtown district, past federal buildings where Sarah spent her days prosecuting organized crime cases, and past the FBI field office where Steele consulted on security matters. The city had become their shared territory, a place where their different skills and experiences complemented each other's work. "The Hells Angels called," Sarah said carefully. "Razor wants to meet with you." Steele's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd expected this conversation eventually, but that didn't make it easier. "What does he want?" "He didn't say, but Agent Reeves thinks it might be an olive branch. The club's been having problems with federal investigations since Marcelli's network was exposed." Steele pulled into the driveway of their small house in a quiet Denver suburb, the kind of neighborhood where federal prosecutors and security consultants could blend in with accountants and insurance salesmen. The house was nothing special. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garage for Steele's consulting equipment, but it was theirs. "You think I should meet with him?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "I think you should do whatever feels right. But remember that you're not the same man who left the club 6 months ago." That evening, Steele called Razor from their back porch, watching the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, while Sarah graded depositions at the kitchen table. The conversation was brief, professional. "Careful, Steele." Razor's voice carried the weight of old friendship and recent betrayal. "Razor, heard you got married. Congratulations." "Thank you." "Listen, and brother, and I know I don't have the right to call you that anymore. The club made a mistake. Fear made us choose survival over loyalty." Steele watched a hawk circle overhead, hunting in the gathering dusk. "Water under the bridge. No, it isn't. What you did at Silver Creek, the way you stood up when it mattered, that's what the club is supposed to be about. Honor, loyalty, protecting the innocent. I'm not looking to rejoin Razor, I know. But if you ever need anything at all, the Colorado chapter owes you a debt." After Steele hung up, Sarah joined him on the porch, settling into the chair beside him. The wedding rings caught the last light of day. 2 circles of gold that represented the possibility of redemption, even for those who'd spent their lives outside the law. "Everything okay?" Steele took her hand, their rings clicking softly together. "Everything's perfect." For the first time in his adult life, Steele Donovan meant exactly what he said. The hand-built rocking chair creaked softly on the front porch of their Montana safe house, its pine frame worn smooth by Steele's patient craftsmanship during the long winter evenings when Sarah's pregnancy had kept them close to home. He'd carved each piece by hand, joining them with traditional techniques his grandfather had taught him decades ago, creating something that would last for generations. The chair was more than furniture. It was a promise to the future, a symbol of the peaceful life they'd built from the ashes of violence. Sarah rested in the chair, her hands folded over the gentle curve of her belly, where their child grew strong and safe. 7 months along now, and the baby moved constantly, as if eager to join the world that Steele and Sarah had fought so hard to make secure. The due date was still 2 months away, but Steele found himself checking the emergency route to the hospital every few days. making sure the roads were clear and the truck was fueled. She's active today, Sarah said, pressing her hand against a particularly enthusiastic kick. Steele settled into the chair beside her, a simpler piece he'd built for himself. The ultrasound said we couldn't tell yet. Call it maternal instinct. Besides, after everything we've been through, I think the universe owes us a daughter. The view from their porch stretched across 50 miles of Montana wilderness, mountain peaks rising like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. The federal government had kept its promise about the safe house, transferring the property to them permanently in recognition of their service. It was isolation, but chosen isolation, the kind that came with peace rather than fear. Steele's consulting business operated from a home office, conducting threat assessments and security training via video conference when possible, traveling only when absolutely necessary. Sarah had taken extended leave from the Justice Department, though she continued to review cases and provide testimony for the ongoing prosecutions of Marcelli's network. "Any word from Agent Reeves?" Steele asked. "The last of the corruption trials wrapped up yesterday. 47 convictions, no acquittals." Sarah smiled with professional satisfaction. David's investigation finally got the justice it deserved. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed valley. Steele watched the bird's effortless flight, thinking about the strange paths that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a solitary man waiting to die alone in a Colorado cabin. Now he was a husband, preparing to become a father, his life finally having the kind of meaning that couldn't be taken away by circumstances or other people's choices. "Do you think we'll be good parents?" Sarah asked, the question carrying the weight of all their shared losses. Steele considered his answer carefully. "I think we understand what children need: safety, love, someone willing to fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. And we definitely know how to fight. We know how to protect what matters." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, strong enough to make Sarah gasp and laugh simultaneously. Steele reached over and placed his weathered hand on her belly, feeling the new life moving beneath his palm. The sensation was miraculous, humbling, terrifying, and wonderful all at once. "What will we tell her about how we met?" Sarah asked. "The truth. That sometimes good people have to make hard choices, and sometimes those choices lead to something beautiful." A truck appeared on the distant road, its dust trail visible for miles in the clear mountain air. Steele watched it approach with the automatic vigilance that would never completely leave him, but without the anxiety that had once accompanied every unexpected visitor. The truck bore federal plates, Agent Reeves making one of her periodic check-ins. "Expecting company?" Steele asked. "She mentioned stopping by with some paperwork." Final details for the Witness Protection Trust Fund. The money from seized Marcelli assets had been substantial, enough to ensure their child's education and security, regardless of what the future might bring. Steele had been uncomfortable with accepting criminal proceeds, but Sarah had convinced him that turning Marcelli's ill-gotten wealth toward protecting innocent children was a form of justice in itself. Agent Reeves climbed out of her truck, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed a long and difficult mission. "Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, how are we feeling today?" "Optimistic," Sarah said, one hand resting on her belly. "Good, because I have some news that might interest you both." Reeves settled into a third chair that Steele had built for visitors, opening the envelope to reveal photographs and documents. Vincent Marcelli had a son, Michael Marcelli, 32 years old, Harvard Law School, clean record. Steele felt old instincts stirring. "Looking for revenge?" "Looking for redemption," Reeves said with a smile. "He's applying for a position with the Justice Department. Wants to spend his life prosecuting the kind of criminal organization his father built." The rocking chair creaked gently as Sarah absorbed this information. In her belly, their daughter moved as if responding to the promise of a world where the children of criminals could choose to become forces for justice. Sometimes, Steele reflected, the future really was worth fighting for.